So the long-awaited Fed chair transition has finally occurred. Jerome Powell's time as the chairman of the Federal Reserve has come to an end, and we now have a new chairman who was just confirmed last week, Kevin Warsh. Now, we've known about Kevin Warsh being the guy for quite some time now, but now that he's officially in the position, in this video, we're going to cover his past, sort of what he used to believe, what he believes now, some of that progression, so we can get a better sense of who it is that will be running the Federal Reserve and how we can expect the Federal Reserve to change during his period. So first, here we are. Let's meet Kevin Warsh. There's a picture of him here on the left during his Senate confirmation hearing. What we're going to talk about in this video, we're going to start with what the FOMC actually is. So what powers does Kevin Warsh have? Section 2, we're going to talk about the 3 phases of Kevin Warsh. When I went back through his career, I noticed there were sort of 3 distinct periods, and we're going to cover those because that might help explain what we can expect moving forward. And then section 3, where do we currently stand when it comes to monetary policy? Before we get into that, some Kevin Warsh fast facts. Number 1, this is really fun. He is the richest Fed chair of all time. It's not actually from his career. He's had a great career, obviously, but it's because he's married to Jane Lauder. So the granddaughter of the Estee Lauder company, family, dynasty, whatever you want to call it. So his marriage to her makes him the richest Fed chair when it comes to household wealth. Number 2, when he was appointed by George Bush number 2, he was the youngest Fed governor. He was appointed at the age of 35. And then number 3, he was actually passed over twice by Trump for positions. So he was one of the finalists on the short list for the Fed chairman when Jerome Powell got it in Trump 1.0. And then for Trump 2.0, before becoming Fed chair just last week, he was actually one of the finalists for the Treasury Secretary position that went to Scott Bessent. So 3rd time's the charm when it comes to Kevin Warsh and getting some sort of position in the Trump administration. So what is the FOMC? We started here with this little graphic here on the left. It is made up of 7 board governors that are appointed by the president and the Senate. They serve 14-year terms. So these are really, really long terms. We've seen, for example, Trump get 1 appointee in besides Warsh. So Warsh is one of the Fed governors. The chair counts as a governor with Mirren. And what you notice is Mirren's the one who's always dissenting, voting for either more aggressive cuts when the FOMC is cutting 25 basis points, or voting for 25 basis points when the FOMC is holding rates steady. And then you have the 12 regional Fed presidents that are appointed by the regional bank boards. And so when the FOMC gets together and votes on policy changes, there are 12 votes. Those come from the 7 board governors, so the 7 Fed governors. That is made up, again, of the chair, and then the 6 other appointed and confirmed board governors. The New York Fed regional president always gets a vote. He's always on it. And then the other 11, there's 4 rotating voting members. So at any given time, 4 of the regional Fed presidents are also voting on policy. So that makes the 12 votes. It is the 7 board governors, which also includes the chair. It is the New York regional Fed president. And then it is 4 rotating regional Fed presidents. So what are the chair's powers? He can do a lot of things. There's a lot of soft power that he has. This is no way an exhaustive list of all of the things he can and could and potentially will do, but I want to just label it down to 5. So are the most important things that I think. He is one of 12 votes on the FOMC. So he doesn't have a super vote. He can be outvoted. Now, I do want to mention here at the bottom, in the modern FOMC era, which is generally considered post-1936, a sitting Fed chair has never been outvoted on a major policy decision. And now you could view that one of 2 ways. One, everyone falls in line and just votes with the chair. Or number 2, the chair shifts around what he actually proposes at the meeting based on the conversations he has with the other governors prior to said meeting. I tend to think of it more of the latter. It would be quite embarrassing if a Fed chair was outvoted. It would really diminish confidence in the Federal Reserve. So I think it probably makes more sense that due to this fact, it's more likely that the Fed chair is not going to propose something that he knows is going to get voted down. So the governors actually have a lot of power in the decision-making process. And need to remind you, Jerome Powell is staying on as one of the governors to finish his term as a governor. So his term as chair is up, but he is still a Fed governor. So he will have a voice at the table still. Number 2, sets the FOMC meeting agenda. So again, this is a little bit of a hard power, a little bit of a soft power, gets to sort of decide what gets talked about. Number 3, as I said, he gets to decide the proposal that gets voted on. So they're not holding tons of different votes based on what other governors want. The Fed chair decides what are we actually voting on. 4, directs the Fed staff. So what are they researching? What are they putting out? That's a little bit of a soft, hard power, right? So if he wants to be a little dovish, you might see more and more research that points to potential rate cuts or easing. And then 5, he's the one who stands up there and conducts the post-meeting press conferences. That's not to say, he's the only one who's using language to dictate expectations in the market. The governors are always giving speeches or speaking at events, but he's the one who stands up there after every single meeting. So again, a little bit of a misconception about, he's going to come in and then all of a sudden we're going to get all of these rate cuts. He's one of 12 votes. Now, what could happen over time is if President Trump gets to appoint more of the governors, then all of a sudden you start seeing more and more friendly voices like Moran, and that could actually start to have a little bit of a shift in the policy or the voting that we see. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 phases of Kevin Warsh. So phase number 1, he was a very, very principled, hawkish Fed governor. He was a Fed governor during the GFC, and he was very worried about inflation, even when no one else basically was. So we'll start in the top left here in March 2007. This was before the worst of the collapse. He says, I remain much more concerned about inflation prospects than about growth. So if we look at the inflation, 2.2%, unemployment at 4.5%, okay, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. However, if you read these quotes going through, you can see during times when the unemployment rate was approaching 10% and core PCE, which is what the Fed looks at, was at 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, he was still really, really worried about inflation. He was worried that the Fed was easing too quickly. It's history has muddied this conversation a little bit. Some say the Fed didn't act quick enough. Some said the Fed acted too quickly. It's debatable whether he was right or wrong during this period. I would tend to lean that he was wrong based on what actually occurred. But that's not really what's important here. The important thing that I want to get across is he was very principled and very, very hawkish, even staring down the face of 10% unemployment. And that brings us to phase 2, where he was an anti-QE crusader and a Fed critic from the outside. So a couple months before he actually resigned, 5 years into his 14-year term as a governor, and he resigned because of continuous QE. He resigned during QE2. He was quoted as saying, the Federal Reserve is not a repair shop for broken fiscal, trade, or regulatory policies. So he had issues with during this time it was Obama. Again, we'll talk about some of the political stuff in the future. But he had issues with some of the policies that were being put in place, both outside and inside the Fed. He was very against quantitative easing, which, to be fair, was an unconventional part of the open market operations of the Fed at the time, and has had a huge, huge, long-lasting implications following 2008. As you can see, since the crisis, the Federal Reserve balance sheet has exploded up from about 1 trillion to 7 trillion around there today, and reaching 9 trillion in the aftermath of COVID. So again, very hawkish, right? He's against this quantitative easing, and actually resigned because he viewed it as inappropriate. And now history is a little bit kinder to him in this regard. So the Fed lost a lot of credibility around the time of QE2. So the second bout of quantitative easing. Here we looked at a CNBC survey on the left of grading Bernanke in December 2010, so before QE2. And 95% of people surveyed give him a passing grade. So if you think this was after the GFC, a few years removed, at that time, the Fed acted really quickly and really aggressively, and clearly was viewed favorably. But then on the right, you see just 6-7 months later, after QE2, this almost completely flips. Now, the question was a little bit different. It was confidence in Ben Bernanke, but you see basically mirror opposites. 4% said yes, they have confidence, and 96% said no. So what do we know about Kevin Warsh thus far in his career? Very principled hawk, willing to resign over his hawkishness, and continues being a hawk even after his time as a Fed governor ends. But something changes when we get to phase 3. You start to see some more political pivots. I tried to make some sort of hawk pun here, so please ignore the black title. The former hawk glides with the political winds. So this basically brings us up today. So let's start in November 2018. Core PCE at 2%, right on the Fed's target. Unemployment, 3.9%. That's great. That's low. Policy rate, 2%. The president at the time was Donald Trump during his first term. Warsh's stance was dovish. Okay, so the principled hawk is now dovish. But let's say, over the period of the time he was a Fed governor, so about a decade from 2007-ish to 2018 at this point, he's seen that the spike in inflation he's been expecting this whole time never really materializes. And now he sort of rethought some of his monetary policy stances and more open to dovishness. Okay, let's just take him at his word. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt here. He's rethought his priors, and now he's making some changes in sort of what he believes. Then we get to February 2022. Core PCE has gone up in the wake of COVID to 5.2%. Unemployment is down to 3.6%. So inflation right now generally seems to be more of a concern. The policy rate is at 0%, right? It's at its zero lower bound. The president is Joe Biden, and Warsh turns back hawkish. Now, again, this is totally reasonable and rational. You can easily make an argument for this. Core PCE has gone up 3.2 from 2% up to 5.2%. Unemployment has come down. The policy rate has come down significantly since we last checked in November 2018. Okay, this could make sense. Right? He rethought his priors, but now inflation has reaccelerated in the wake of COVID. And so now I am hawkish again. But these last two columns is where things start to get a little bit shaky, and it's harder to give Warsh the benefit of the doubt. So you have October 2024. PCE has now come down from 5.2% to 2.7%. So inflation is much, much closer to the target of 2%. Unemployment, 4.1%. So we didn't see, a big rise in unemployment with the fall in inflation. Remember, the Fed had been cutting rates at this point. Hiking rates at this point. That's very important. The policy rate is all the way up to 4.75%. Okay, so inflation is somewhat under control. Unemployment, we didn't see a huge spike. The policy rate is much higher than it has been previously at 4.75%. And the president at the time is Joe Biden. and he's hawkish. This is around the time the Fed pivoted and started to cut a little bit because, again, it was generally viewed as inflation being under control. Um, you know, he was still hawkish. So this was the 50%, 50 basis point cut. He did not see a reason for that. Um, a little bit harder to give him the benefit of the doubt here based on the other columns. And then all of this sort of falls apart when you get to November of 2025. So if you compare the last two columns, core PCE, so inflation is now higher than it was when he was hawkish in October 2024. Unemployment is the same. The policy rate has been lower. So when he was hawkish at 4.75% and at 2.7% core PCE, now the policy rate is lower, core PCE is higher, but Trump is president, and now we see a more dovish flip of Kevin Warsh. So when people don't have confidence in Kevin Warsh or question what he believes, it's really this phase 3 that gives people pause. Because prior to this, he was a very principled, hawkish, monetary policy stance type of guy. He always leaned hawkish. And now more recently, in the last 8 or so years, we've seen this sort of flip-flop back and forth based on who has been in the White House. And so that brings a lot of questions. What are we about to see from our Federal Reserve chair moving forward? It's unclear. Was this sort of an act so he could get the job, and now he's going to revert back to his old ways? So is the hawkish governor still in there somewhere? Or is he going to be a more dovish, patsy voice based on what the president wants? And that brings us to where do we actually stand today? So inflation is a problem. Inflation is a concern. The market is worried about inflation. Based on the April CPI report, it was hotter than expected, up significantly. There are some issues with this calculation based on the government shutdown. So the rise in core CPI, again, stripping out food and energy, might not be as concerning. This was last week's video. I'll have a tab pop up in one of the corners right now if you want to watch that. But inflation is a concern. Inflation has accelerated on the back of the war in Iran, and the market no longer expects rate cuts in 2026. So at the start of the year, you can see that at least one rate cut by the end of the year was like 95%. Two or more was actually above 70%. It was about 75%. So the market really expected multiple rate cuts to start the year. But because of the inflation data, that has not come to fruition. The market no longer expects cuts. So the markets currently have confidence that the Fed will not cut rates while inflation pressures persist. So now, is this confidence in Kevin Warsh, or is it confidence in the FOMC process? Kevin Warsh is just one voice and won't be able to shift things so much. Who's to say, really? And then finally, we're going to look at other sort of confidence in the Fed type of metrics. So we have the five-year forward break even on the left here. It's basically where do bond markets think that inflation is going to be 4 or 5 years, 5 years from now? Generally, we'd want that number around 2%, just because that's where the Fed's target is. If this were to if this were to go higher than 2%, that would be the bond market losing faith in the Fed's ability to keep inflation around its target. That has not happened. It's been sort of steady around 2%, a little bit above, but nothing concerning. Not a lot of volatility here. Starting to see a little bit more on the consumer side. They're starting to get a little bit skittish based on the war. Again, headline inflation affects consumers. They're buying food, they're buying gas. When inflation rises, when headline inflation rises, consumers get more concerned about inflation. And again, that can impact, just the concern about inflation can impact inflation in the future. So if people are asking for higher wages because they expect their costs to be higher in the future, then businesses might have to raise prices to accommodate those higher wages. So it's very important that people remain confident in the Fed And what we've seen thus far is that quantitative measures, like the 5-year forward break even, still has a lot of confidence in the Fed. I would say consumers do as well. This isn't super dramatic. And generally, the consumer is more likely to overreact to near-term things like the US-Iran war. Again, who knows how long that will drag out. But for now, the Fed still has confidence in one of two things. They have confidence that Kevin Warsh is not going to come in and drastically change the direction of where the Fed is headed, or they believe that he will be unable to due to the processes set in place in the FOMC and his unwillingness to potentially get embarrassed by proposing things that would ultimately get voted down by the governors. So this video is a little longer than normal, but we have a new Fed chair. We haven't had one of those for some years now, so I thought it was important to do a little bit of a deep dive. I'm going to leave you here. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new. If you did, it would be awesome if you could like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're getting really close to 1,000 subscribers, which would be really great. Again, thank you, and I will see you next week for another Macro Monday video.